Join me today as we take a historic trip through the Hinton Historical Museum. Now, what's really interesting about this museum is it seems to be in an unknown, hard to find location, and it is filled with unique artifacts that you're not going to find anywhere else. It has the largest collection of barbed wire, larger than the Cowboy Museum has. It has the largest collection of telephones, larger than the Telephone Museum, and it has quite the history of vehicles, starting with buggies. Yes, once again, the largest collection of buggies, all the way through the modern era of gasoline-powered vehicles and trucks. So this is going to be quite the exciting journey today as we look at everything that this museum has to offer. Come on in and join me as we look at this. And as you spot something unique to you or that you know something about, fill in a comment, let me know what you see, and fill in any details that I may have missed. Here we start with a look back at history. On the left here we have a 1901 telephone. This would have been one of the original style telephones that people had mounted in their houses. A wire would be run directly to that all the way back to the main switchboard, wherever that was for the town. To use it, you'd lift this handle on the left and hold that to your ear, and you'd speak into essentially the nose of it. If somebody was calling, the switchboard would send some signal down to ring those bells for you. So that's a 1901 Kellogg phone. Here we have a 1912 Western Electric reproduction phone. And this one actually is very much a reproduction because it has touch tone dialing capabilities, which would not have been the case. Here we have a phone from 1906. And then we have a desk phone down here from 1915. Over here would have been the original style desk phone. This is a 1904 Western Electric candlestick phone. These candlesticks were used instead of wall mounts and worked very much on the same principle. And when you needed to make a call, you would lift up the earpiece, which would connect it, and then you jiggle the earpiece to let the operator on the other side know that you were picking up your phone and wanted to make a call. Down here we see a few more modern telephones. The one on the right is a wall phone. That would have been a pulse dial. We have a 1943 Ericsson, a 1931 Stormberg, and a 1922 telephone, which was officially made with bakelite, and this one has a crank on it, and you would crank that crank to let the operator know you wanted to make a call. Now the early switchboards looked a lot like this. This one's a 1954 Western Electric switchboard. And when somebody would jiggle their handle or want to make a call, a light would light up, letting the operator know that on that extension, there was somebody, and the operator would answer that call, plug into it, find out who they wanted to call, and then patch them through to the correct person, or patch them to another phone system somewhere else so that they could make a long distance call. Now this handset on the left here was not original to these. They usually had headsets like these, and this one also has a pulse dial, rotary dial on it. Here we have a telephone switchboard from 1942. This one also has a slight period inaccuracy with the handset. That would not have existed originally with this, but this is where your manager would plug in their headset to listen to your calls as you were plugged in and using your headset to answer calls and be the operator. The Hinton Historical Museum actually has the largest collection of telephones in the United States of America. There are more telephones here than actually in the Telephone Museum. And I've been to both now, and I can tell you this collection is a lot more extensive and has more history to it. Let's continue looking at telephones to see all that this rich history has for us. We start off with a collection of wall phones from all different eras. On the left, we have a 1901 Swedish America split box phone. Then we move to an 1889 split box. So this is pre-turn of that century of the 1900s, which is where we generally think of as the modern era started. It actually began in the late 1800s. Moving along here in the middle, we have another 1900 split box. And here we have a Stormberg Carlson 1894 split box telephone. up top here, we have dry cell batteries that would have been used to offer power assist to phones when they were out in rural areas or when a phone actually needed to supply its own power. Dry cell batteries are very rarely used for anything anymore. Now on the end here we have a Swedish-American 1908 phone that has been converted to be a switchboard for a hotel. At the very top where we see those numbers, those little metal plates with the numbers, if somebody called in on that extension, the metal plate would drop down, letting the operator know there was somebody that wanted to connect from that extension. The operator would then answer and use the patch cord to patch them to where they needed to connect to. Here we have a 1909 Western Electric 3-slot payphone. Now this is quite unique that it was a payphone and the operator would have to listen for the clinks as the money went into the payphone. The way it worked was there's a little drop box here, and when somebody dropped the money in, whether it was a nickel, a dime, or a quarter, the operator would hear a tone letting them know that the money was put in. Now, it was possible to trick the operator and either make the tone or put in false money, and it would still register. But that's what they had. That was one of the early stages of trying to create a pay telephone system. This is a 1901 telephone right here in the middle. And we have an 1896 this is a hard name for me, the Umwe Burger Company. I'm probably saying that wrong and I apologize, but it's an 1896 telephone from Germany. We have a 1913 Western Electric. Here we have a 1936 Stormberg Carlson with the original phone instructions actually in here that would tell you how to use the phone. Now you see the bells below these, they are not part of the phones, those are just separate bell boxes. And we'll take a look at those in a moment. We have a 1910 from Kellogg Company, a 1900 from Stromberg, a 1906 American Electric, another American Electric, a 1908 Monarch Company phone, another Monarch, and here we see another split box, an 1848, one of the earliest available phones that we're going to find. This is a Western Electric Howler. And we have a Commonwealth of Australia phone from 1910, and hidden in the corner would be an Ericsson phone from 1908. Now let's take a look quick at the bell boxes that are here. So there are all different bell boxes that would have been used like in your barn or somewhere where you could hear that there was a phone call coming in, so that then you could run to the phone to answer and talk to the operator. Now we move to all the candlestick style phones. These are Kellogg candlesticks from 1910. This phone is unique because it has a headset attached for the earpiece, but the mouthpiece is mounted on like an accordion. As is the case with this one, it's a handheld earpiece, but the mouthpiece is also on an accordion. This would be the French style handset, another candlestick, a 1904 Chicago Telephone Company, a Stromberg carbon candlestick, a Stromberg Carlson candlestick from 1904, Now we enter an era where the candlesticks got rotary dials on them, so you no longer needed the operator to connect you. You could dial directly to where you wanted to go, and the phone switches would recognize the pulse dialing, and through a series of clicking the switches, it would connect you through. And now we move into an era where there were standard, or what we would think of as more standard desk phones. Notice yet they still can't dial because they still need an operator. This is actually a Motorola right here in the middle from 1954. Here we have a 1909 Ericsson, and this one has a hand crank on the side yet to connect. Federal from 1945. Okay, and now we move into the rotary dials again, where the operator wasn't required anymore. You could actually dial on your own with a rotary dial. Ooh, this was a very unique one originally because you have multiple phone lines connected to it. You would push the white button to select the phone line that you were going to dial out of. One of the early multi-line telephones right here, and another version of the multi-line telephone. Now this one would have been mounted either like in a business or a hotel, or a situation where multiple people had access to the area where the phone was, but the company didn't want to pay for all your calls, so they would put a lock on it to lock it out. Now this particular enclosure is an explosion-proof enclosure. These would be used in like oil refinery, gas refinery type facilities, as well as mills that produced flour. Flour is very explosive, as is gas and oil when it's in the refinery process. So they would mount the phones in these boxes. That way when they rung, they didn't spark and blow up the factory. We have a 1946 Stromberg Carlson. This one has multi-line selection on it. And here we have a 1936 Chicago Secretary phone. We have a few more of the wall-mounted box phones, as well as all these bells for different phone lines that are ringing. Another Chicago Secretary phone from 1936. This one would have been more of an intercom style, as well as this box would be for intercom as well, which worked on the same principle as the phone lines. We move along to more wall-mounted style phones. Here we move into the more modern phones that were wall-mounted with rotary dials on them. And then as we move down, you see all the color options that became available. Now on these color phones especially, that very top part was designed very specifically. Right here, right up top here, is where you could take the handset and lay it up there so that the phone call didn't hang up if you needed to go get somebody. That was a specific design feature from that era forward. Most phones had an option so you could rest the handset without having to hang it up or just leave it lay on the floor. And then we've got the desk phones down here. These also have a feature, I'm trying to remember where and how that one worked, where they had a hand rest option so that you didn't have to just lay the phone on your desk. And now here, one of the original business multi-line phones here. This was a pretty fancy phone to have back in the day, where you had all of those phone lines on one phone. Here we move into a collection of payphones. This particular one that we're looking at in the middle of the screen is encased in metal. It is because it's a prison payphone. You would use a payphone like this in prisons and in areas of high vandalism to protect the phone. Moving along, we've got one of the early touch tone payphones. And here we've got rotary dial payphones as well. Payphones also got mounted in booths like this one here. This is a Southwestern Bell telephone booth, which is essentially a closet that you would go into to make a call. In these booths, there's always a payphone. There's frequently a phone book mounted by a cable. And then sometimes there's a little bit of a desk area to make notes or to hold the book while you were looking up a phone number for somebody. And this one's super fancy, where it also has a little seat in it so that you could sit. And when you entered this is a bifold door right here that you would close. And when you closed it, there's a little pressure switch that would, since the door closed, it would turn on a light and a fan to create a little bit of airflow and give you a little bit of light in there. From this era, they moved into this more aluminum style phone booth. That phone sign on the top could also light up. And here you can see the bifold door is partly closed already. And same style, you would slide that door closed. This one also has a payphone in it and a little writing table so you could write down your notes. Here we've got hand crank adding machines. Talk about how far the calculations have come. With the modern calculator, can do so much more. All these could do is add or subtract, and then you'd push in a number, then you'd take this little handle here and ratchet it up and back. It would print on that little tape the number, and it would add the numbers up. Now this machine here is the electrified version of that, where instead of having to push the handle yourself, it had a little motor to do it. Another adding machine. And then moving along, this machine right here is actually a check writer. You would change the numbers to the number that you wanted to be printed on your check, and then you could put your check in it and it would write that number. Here we've got some paper embossers that will emboss a seal in the paper. I know it's hard to see that, but it would make a little raised indentation with whatever symbol or writing is on that embosser. This is a manual version of the check writer, actually two of them here side by side. Same idea, where you would move these sliders right here. You would move these sliders to the numbers that you wanted, then take this crank handle, pull it back with your check inserted in here, and it would print that amount on the check so you didn't have to hand write your checks. Now we move to typewriters. So this is what typewriters were originally like. They were all these little arms. Each arm has a letter, and they have a high and a low spot. There's two letters on there, the capital version and the lowercase version, both. And when you push the shift key, it moves the arm of letters back and forward so that it would choose the right letter when it struck the paper. When you push any one of the letter keys, it makes that arm swing up and press against this roller. Your paper would be there. It goes right in this little slot here. That arm goes in there, presses against that ink ribbon, which then presses against the paper to make the impression on your paper of that one letter. Now, if you made a mistake, there was no erasing it. You needed to start over. All of these typewriters seem to be from about the 20s and the 30s. Oh, now we move into what would have been considered one of the most common typewriters, and the one that most offices had, and originally very, very special, and you were quite impressive if you had one of these. This one's electric. So no longer did you have to push with enough force to make the imprint on the paper yourself. This would do that for you by typing. This one worked off what was called the IBM Selectrix ball. This here has all the letters on it. You could remove the ball with a different font ball instead, and it would use the same method of all those letters would then press against the paper through that little plastic piece there, through a ribbon onto the paper, the letter that you're trying to type. Now this one also came, see that orange handle there, with what was called an erase ribbon. If you made a mistake, you could backspace, it would lift that tape, put that in front of the letter would push against the paper and remove that spot of ink. It wasn't perfect, but it was so much better than needing to retype the entire paper over again. Now this one isn't the version past that, but there was another version of this exact typewriter that had a connector in the back that you could connect to a computer. Now computers back then were not even close to what we have today. But if you had what we would consider today a Word document, but they would consider a word processing document, if you connected it to this typewriter, it could essentially type that document out for you. Coffee originally did not come pre-ground. You would go to the corner market or the general market or the general store in your town, and you'd buy coffee beans, and the store would have one of these. They would put the beans in the top up here, and then you would turn the crank and it would grind it and make ground coffee for you. Now over here we have a grits mill, not a grist mill, a grits mill where you would grind your grits. Probably also found at the local store. Here's a walnut sheller, a corn sheller, and a peanut sheller. Now this device here, I don't know what this is. It says Atwood Cracker Manufacturing Company, patented SW46-Oklahoma City. So this may have been patented in Oklahoma, but I don't know what you use this for. This is looking down inside the top. It has a motor at the bottom with a belt that then comes up and runs this machine, whatever it did. Here's a lard press. I mean, back then you didn't waste your leftover lard, you didn't waste drippings. You would actually put them in one of these, which would squeeze out any excess juice from your lard and make like a lard cake. You could use your lard cake to spread on toast or for future cooking. Here we have an apple press, so you could put the apples in the bottom portion and then turn the crank and it would squeeze down, forcing all the juices to come out into a bucket sitting below it. This machine is a clover cutter, and I don't know what a clover cutter did, and the write-up on it is a little blurred out, so I'm not sure what it says. So if you know what a clover cutter is, or any of these machines did, do me a favor and write in the comments explaining what you know about these fantastic pieces here. It may be hard to imagine, but in the 1800s, this is how you took a bath, even into the early 1900s. Many houses didn't have indoor plumbing, so they had galvanized tubs. Think of it like a feeding trough or a water stock tank, stock tank. And you would put some water in here, sometimes just cold water. Sometimes you would take a bucket and warm it up at the fire and put that in here to warm it up. And this is where you took your bath. Now, quite often, an entire family would take the bath in the same water. Frequently, you started with the oldest member of the house and went down to the youngest member of the house. So this is one time when you didn't want to be the youngest because you got the dirty leftover bath water. While we're on the topic of being at home, these are early irons. These irons came about 1705, and really they're just a large piece of metal. You would put them on the fire or near the fire to warm up, and then you would press it out over your clothes, rubbing it back and forth to get the wrinkles out. When it cooled down too much, you would put it back in the fire to warm it back up. Then about in 1752, somebody got the idea that they could put the hot coals from the fire inside of the iron to heat it up. Fire hazard? Yeah, it was, but it felt more efficient than having to put this back in the fire constantly. Here you could keep going until your coals got cold. These are all different versions of that same iron. Moving along here, we've got one of the coal style that also had steam available, and then we move to more gas-powered ones. You could put gas in them, believe it or not, to create the fire. And then finally we move to the electric era, where this one had an electric heating element in it that would then heat the metal plate at the bottom so that you didn't need the fire anymore. So if we had irons, we must have had laundry to clean. This is a clothes boiler. You would put your clothes in here to boil them to start the cleaning process. This roller would help you scrub your clothes, as this board at the bottom, this washboard at the bottom, you would rub your clothes against it in a bucket. You could also use this hand stomp from the 1890s that you would use to push up and down against your clothes. Now you've got a rocking scrubber from 1900, which was quite the innovation, because now you could rock this back and forth against your clothes and clean more clothes at one time. Then in 1901, we got a rocking version of this with a stainless or a galvanized type tub. And here you could see somebody using it, as well as the wringer at the top. Once you were done washing the clothes in the machine, you would then push your clothes through those wheels, which would squeeze out the extra water. Here's another version from 1902. And now 1903, we come up with a more mechanized version where you would turn the crank on the side, which would turn an agitator to agitate the clothes, more like what we know as a modern washing machine with a center agitator. Now here's a fancy version of that from 1905 that also has the wringer mounted on top. So when you were done washing your clothes in your fancy hand-cranked machine, you could then hand crank them through the wringer to wring out as much water as possible. Here's one from 1910. This one they decided to go square. But then in 1912 we get the electric version and it goes back to being round. Now in this one, the center agitator would go up and down as well as spin around to agitate the clothes. Then when you felt your clothes were adequately washed, you would put them over here in this basket, which would spin like the spin cycle in your washing machine to wring them out. This replaced the need to hand crank through the wringer at the top between those rollers. In 1917, we have this Apex electric washing machine. So it's also electrified to agitate the clothes, but this one didn't yet have the spinner on it. This one still used the wringer. In 1933, we see Maytag came out with this machine. This one is also electric, but also had an electrically driven wringer. So you could push your clothes through the wringer, but you didn't have to hand crank the wringer anymore. In 1951, Maytag started making their machines prettier and more appealing to the housewife who was doing the laundry. So that's when you started coming out with these white machines, still with a center basin with an agitator and a wringer at the top. And not to be outdone, in 1955, Montgomery Ward made this round one that also is white and pretty to the person using it. And I don't know if you remember anything about Montgomery Ward, but it was essentially like Sears. They carried everything. They were a department store that used to be very well known, but is no longer in existence. Here we have a collection of vacuums. The one on the left here, let's take a look at that. This one's very unique. This was the first vacuum, and it wasn't called a vacuum. It was called a hand pump vacuum sweeper, because prior to this, they would sweep the floors. This one you would use the center handle and pull to suck up what was down at the bottom, hence creating the vacuum to suck the dirt up. These here are carpet sweepers, as you push them along the floor, there are little rollers inside that would sweep up the crumbs or the dirt into a little catch basin. Then came along the electric vacuum. This went back to that idea of sucking, and it used a motor to create the suction to then take the dirt and put them in a bag that you could then empty later. Homes continued to get more advanced, where originally toast had to be put up against a fire or bread was put by the fire to create the toast. Then in 1915, Speedmaster made this electric toaster. You would use these little wooden handles. This would open up, you'd put a piece of bread in there and close it against some electrified heating elements, which would then warm up and make the toast. In 1923, we see Sunbeam come to the table now, as they started creating a toaster as well. Now this 1921 Speedmaster, you would lay the toast on top, and inside there were the heating elements that would heat the toast one side at a time. Then Toastmaster, which was made by Westinghouse in 1926, came out with this model, which would heat both sides of the toast at one time. You would put one slice of toast in the middle, and you'd push the plunger down to bring the toast inside. And Dominion in 1948 made a two-slice version of that, not to be outdone by the single slice, or to outdo the single slice. You can now do two slices of toast at one time. Cameras also came a long way. From 1884, this is an original style camera, and what would happen is a large plate would go inside. This black section would be just dark. You'd have a hood over the back side so no light could get in from the back side, and light would be allowed in from the front side, which would then expose the plate, and the plate would then have a production of what the lens saw. So the subject would have to stand on the side of the lens perfectly still for multiple minutes, approximately 5 minutes for this to work. And if you wiggled, it wouldn't expose you properly, and essentially there are a lot of pictures where you can see legs but no body because somebody moved while the plate was being exposed. Think now if we had to be still for 5 minutes. I'm not sure any of us could do it. But cameras came a long way. They started getting more technology built into them. They started having flash bulbs. They could expose the film quicker. And they also became more portable, as you see here. That still had the pop-out lens with the accordion, but you could carry that one a lot easier. And that came in multiple varieties for years. And then eventually you had a camera like this that had a Polaroid in it that could then make the instant image. In the 1800s, as people tried to be more mobile, they started trying to play with different ways to make the bike more efficient. As you see here, this is a high wheel bike. They would put a big wheel on the front and a small wheel on the back with the idea that it was more efficient to pedal this and get somewhere faster. Clearly these didn't work very well because they really didn't last long before they went back to standard, similar sized wheels in both the front and the back. And as you look through history, you'll see high wheel in front, high wheel in the back. You'll see all different variations, but ultimately bicycles keep coming back to two wheels of about the same size. Here we have a Summons 28-inch bike with wood rims. So before they had metal, they would still use spokes, just like a modern bike, but the rims were made out of wood. Then we move into the 20s with a Simmons 26-inch bike. Now this one here has metal rims, and it has a chain guard to protect a woman's skirt from getting caught in the chain. In 1935, Hawthorne made this bike out of aluminum. This would have been a lighter frame bike, and for a headlight, this light looks like it would have had multiple D batteries to power that light, and they weren't very bright. Now we have a 1949 Schwinn WZ frame 26-inch bicycle with a Whizzer motor kit attached. You could buy a kit to attach to it that included a motor and a belt that then powered the back wheel. So now you could motorize your Schwinn bicycle. This is also a 1952 Schwinn, similar to the one without, now this one doesn't have a motor. It is a different frame, but very similar in style to the one that you would put the motor in. Another 1952 Girls Deluxe 26-inch bike also has chain guards on it to protect you from getting your dress caught in the chain. Here we have a bicycle from Mary. It's a 1960s Flying O Express. And then we move into the era of Sears. So this is a 1960s Sears 26-inch girls bicycle, which was actually built by Mary, but sold by Sears with the Sears name on it. And that is how Sears made a lot of things back in the day, was they'd buy from other manufacturers and put their names on it. And then we also have a bicycle built for two. And this is a Schwinn bicycle built for two, which has the extended frame on it. Now we're moving into transportation. This is an early sled from the 1800s. It would have been horse-drawn, typically by one horse for this size sled. It had a nice soft velour seat on it. And this one's super fancy with this box down at the bottom that you would put hot coals in to actually have a foot heater in it to help you stay toasty warm. And moving along from a horse-drawn sleigh, we have a horse-drawn carriage. This is an 1886 Studebaker family wagon. Did you know Studebaker's original mode of transportation, fancy vehicles, was actually horse-drawn carriages? They didn't always make gasoline-powered or horseless vehicles. First, their vehicles were horse-drawn carriages. And you see the heavy springs on this, which would help give a smooth, comfortable ride to the passengers in this buggy. Now it has some steps on the side for the passengers to easily get up into their buggy, as well as a nice braking system and super comfortable, durable seating. At least for the late 1800s this was. Here we have a U.S. mail delivery wagon. So instead of the modern mail truck that you know of, this is what they used to deliver mail. And now if we look inside this one, there's another really unique feature that was used back in this era, where the soft, comfortable seating was actually made out of grass or hay. And here you can see a horse took a bite out of this one. Probably a hungry horse, but you can see that grass in there that they used to stuff the seats to make them soft. Pretty much all of the wagons or soft seating from this era would have used that same style stuffing to stuff their seats to make them soft. Here we have a piano box buggy, and this buggy came with either a cloth or leather trim in it, which made it an extra fancy buggy. And when it was brand new, this buggy cost you a whole $53.50 plus $15 extra if you wanted rubber tires on it. So what you would do is here, instead of being a hard metal surface, you would put rubber on here, which would actually give you a softer, more gentle ride. And it was a quieter ride. Here we have an example of one of the first convertibles. That black top could fold down so that you could actually ride with an open air experience. Or if you wanted, you could put the black top back up to be more enclosed and protected from the sun or the weather. Here we have an 1897 platform wagon. This would be more along the lines of your family minivan. Here we have another Studebaker, but this is not a fancy Studebaker. Other than the seat has springs on it to give you a softer, gentler ride, this is a utility vehicle that Studebaker had made, but quite the nice utility vehicle at that. So think of this as your modern delivery truck, but back then, I guess, this would have been modern back in the day, and super fancy with the brake lever on the side and these springs to give the driver a more gentle ride. Here we have an 1887 Phaeton, and that back seat is the first time we have reference of a rumble seat. So it's a lower rear seat called a rumble seat. Now this is quite the fancy, more limousine style ride. This is a 1905 Curtin Rockaway, sometimes referred to as the station rockaway. This would be known as a station wagon, which is where the term comes from, but this was quite the elegant ride. So your driver would be up front, you'd have a separate driver, and then you and your passengers would sit back here in style and comfort. You could close the door, you could close the windows and ride in complete privacy while your driver up front endured the harsh weather and drove for you. This also came with lanterns on it so that the driver could see at night. Here we have a 1906 four-passenger opera bus. Now this would be the original bus. So your driver, once again, would sit up front. This one also had lanterns on it so that you could see at night. And the passengers would sit in the back facing each other on these bench-style seats. Now, as you see, there's not a lot of leg room in here. So you would be crammed in here, but it was an efficient way to transport multiple people. Here's an image of what that may have looked like with just two people and a small child inside. Here we have another Studebaker freight wagon. Now this one is more well used, but as you see, it still has that soft cushioned ride with those springs, as well as the nice brake mechanism to help slow it down. Studebaker made very nice freight vehicles back when they made these wagons. This wagon here would be something similar to the modern day pickup. It's an express wagon, which is what would be considered a medium class freight wagon, just like a pickup truck is considered medium class weight. So your driver would sit up front, and then you had your little pickup back. Now granted, this was quite the luxurious version of the freight wagon, but that's what this one is. There are much more utility style versions of this, but if you had a little bit more money and a little bit more class, this might be the one that you used. Here we have a side spring buggy, often known as the doctor's buggy. And if you ever watched Little House on the Prairie, I believe the doctor actually did drive one of these in Little House on the Prairie. Here is a 1906 chauffeur Seri wagon. Now, as you see, this one also has a lantern on each side on the front. It has the driver area as well as a soft red velour seating on the inside. This is a French style vis-a-vis, which means face to face. So in this particular wagon, you had your driver up front, just like typical, but now in the back you had two seats facing each other, one facing forward, one facing backwards. And vis-a-vis means face to face. So you see you would walk up into the middle here. The passengers here would be facing forward, while the passengers on this side would be facing backwards. Now, during the ride here, you and your passengers could easily carry on a conversation while your driver drove you to your destination. Here we have an 1887 side spring platform wagon with the fringe on top. So this would have also been considered quite fancy, and yellow wheels as well. Right next to that, we have an 1872 Seri wagon with the fringe on top as well. This one even has the mounting point to hold the whip for your horse, and it has fancy fenders on it to keep the mud from slinging all over, as well as in the fender, they created the step for the passengers to be able to step into the back. And here we have an 1885 platform wagon and a 1904 Seri wagon. Now this one's a little bit fancier. It does have the lanterns on it and soft velour seating, and it has the fenders with the step built in. So along came the invention of a horseless carriage, a way to move your carriage without a horse. We typically refer to them now as cars, but back originally they used carriages and put a motor in them. This is a 1903 Oldsmobile. Now also notice uniquely, there's no spot to connect the horse up front, and it was using this stick here to steer it. Now with this stick, if you moved it too much, which is easy to do, you would quickly flip over your horseless carriage. On the front, you still had lanterns to light your way, so this would have been usable at nighttime. Then we started to turn the wagons into something that's a little more familiar with us today with this 1916 Model T Roadster. So now the vehicle started to take on a different shape where the motor was mounted in front and your carriage looking back still pretty much existed. If you look at that, that's still kind of a carriage back, but they added a front section to the carriage which now housed your motor. Also inside, it no longer has a steering stick, but a steering wheel. And then the horn on it was simply a little squeeze horn. This one also still had lanterns on it to light your way. By 1930, vehicles have come a long way. Now this one has electric lights on the front, an electric horn on the front as well, and fancy yellow wheels. It has full doors on it, so now you could enclose inside, and it has glass. And in 1930, you even had a windshield wiper for when you were driving in bad weather. The inside was a nice, soft interior, complete with your steering wheel and an early version of your dashboard. Vehicles continued to get nicer and nicer. This is a Chevrolet from 1928. It is a Series AB, which was quite often used by businessmen. Think more like bankers or stock traders, or affluent type businessmen would use this. It has a shiny finish to it. It has electric lights in the front. It has a big Chevrolet emblem in the front, as well as a fancy hood ornament now. So vehicles started to come out looking nicer and more prestigious than they had before. Now this is only for two people. You had the nice soft seat for the driver and passenger on a bench seat, and a wood steering wheel, and a nice dashboard. Now we see the predecessor to the modern pickup truck. This is the 1929 International 1-ton pickup. Much like your current Ford or Chevys, like a Ford F-150 or a Chevy 1500 or a Ram 1500, this was the predecessor to that, made by International. As you see, it's not as pretty as some of the other vehicles, but this was intended to work. It wasn't designed to be pretty. It has the utility bed on the back, as well as inside it still has a soft seat and a wood steering wheel, but no other comforts. Now comes an era of Bonnie and Clyde. This is the style vehicle that Bonnie and Clyde were actually killed in. It is a 1939 Ford Deluxe. You start to have hubcaps now and big white walls on the wheels, making this a standout vehicle of the day. This also has 4 doors, but the rear door is what is known as a suicide door. If you notice, these handles are very close together. The rear door would open backwards and the front door would open as we normally expect towards the front. The back still had soft seating, and the front also had a nice soft seat. Here you didn't have a wood steering wheel, but now your dashboard starts to integrate gauges and a speedometer in it, as well as heating. In 1958, Henry Ford decided to create a new brand in honor of his son called the Edsel brand. Edsel only produced cars for 2 years, 1958 and 1959, ended the production of the Edsel. I believe there are 1960 Edsels that were produced in 1959. But this was a terrible marketing mistake. The car was ahead of its times for what it is, and it was way too expensive. But this car was designed to compete with Oldsmobile. Oldsmobile was a fancier car than what Ford had produced at the time. So now in modern terms, we can think of this as the predecessor to the Lincoln, which is still produced by the Ford Motor Company. Here we see you've got a chrome center ring on your steering wheel, which is your horn. You've got push button controls in the center of that as your gear selector, and you've got a full dashboard of different instruments, giving you the feel that you are in quite the special vehicle. There's also a radio over here with push button selector to select your radio station, and then big fancy switches to turn on things like your wiper, your heating blower, and other lights. So even though the Edsel was a complete utter failure, which in modern day, the Edsel is a roughly $2 billion mistake by Ford Motor Company. They did learn a lesson from this, continued to produce Ford vehicles, and later on in history started producing the Lincoln. Although the Edsel may have been a complete failure for the Ford Motor Company and for Henry Ford's son, Edsel, which Edsel Company was named after, this museum clearly was not a mistake. This museum is fantastic. It is packed with a lot of things, and we only just began to scratch the surface of everything that is here. I hope you enjoyed the journey with me today. Do me a favor and click that subscribe button so that you can join me on more future adventures, finding more unique hidden places, just like this Hinton Historical Museum. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you on our next adventure.